The musket ball whistled past Lieutenant Colonel George Washington's ear as he crouched behind a fallen oak, the acrid smell of gunpowder thick in the Virginia wilderness. At 22, the young colonial officer had already learned that war was far from the romantic adventure he had once imagined. The date was July 3, 1754, and the world was about to witness the opening shots of what would become known as the French and Indian War. Washington's journey to this moment had begun 2 years earlier when Governor Robert Dinwiddie of Virginia had tasked him with a seemingly impossible mission: deliver an ultimatum to the French forces occupying the Ohio Valley. The French, led by Captain Jacques Lagardeau de Saint-Pierre, had been steadily encroaching on British colonial territory, building a chain of forts from Lake Erie to the forks of the Ohio River. The young Washington, tall and imposing at 6 feet 2 inches, had volunteered for the dangerous journey through hundreds of miles of untamed wilderness. The expedition had been fraught with peril from the beginning. Washington assembled a small party that included the renowned frontiersman Christopher Geist, translator Jacob Van Brom, and several hardy woodsmen. They departed from Williamsburg in late October 1753 as the autumn leaves painted the Virginia countryside in brilliant hues of gold and crimson. The journey north would take them through Pennsylvania's treacherous terrain, where hostile Native American tribes loyal to the French posed constant threats. During the grueling march, Washington demonstrated the leadership qualities that would later make him legendary. When their horses became mired in swamps and streams, he dismounted and walked alongside his men. When food ran low, he shared his own rations. When the weather turned bitter cold, he ensured his soldiers had adequate shelter before seeking his own comfort. These acts of selflessness earned him the unwavering loyalty of his men, a trait that would serve him well in the battles to come. The French stronghold of Fort Le Boeuf, nestled in the Pennsylvania wilderness near present-day Waterford, presented an intimidating sight when Washington's party finally arrived in December 1753. The fort's wooden palisades and strategically placed cannons spoke of French determination to hold their ground. Captain Saint-Pierre, a courteous but resolute officer, received Washington with diplomatic formality, but made it clear that France had no intention of abandoning their claims to the Ohio Valley, according to historical accounts documented in the Pennsylvania Gazette. Washington's diplomatic mission revealed the growing tensions between European powers over North American territories. The return journey proved even more perilous than the outbound trek. Washington and Gist became separated from their party and found themselves alone in the wilderness with hostile warriors in pursuit. During one harrowing encounter, Washington nearly drowned when he fell through ice while crossing the Allegheny River. Only Gist's quick thinking and a makeshift raft saved the future president's life. The incident served as a harsh reminder of the unforgiving nature of frontier warfare, where death could come from the elements as readily as from enemy weapons. When Washington finally returned to Williamsburg in January 1754, his report confirmed Governor Dinwiddie's worst fears. The French were not merely occupying the Ohio Valley, they were fortifying it with the clear intention of permanent settlement. War was inevitable, and Virginia would need to act swiftly to protect British interests in the region. The young officer's detailed observations and recommendations impressed colonial leaders, earning him promotion to lieutenant colonel in command of a newly formed Virginia regiment. The morning mist clung to the Allegheny Mountains like a shroud as Washington led his regiment of 150 men through the dense Pennsylvania forest. It was May 28, 1754. Intelligence reports suggested that French forces were advancing toward the strategic location known as Great Meadows. The young commander's orders were clear: prevent French expansion and protect British colonial interests at all costs. Washington's force consisted primarily of Virginia militiamen, supplemented by a handful of regular soldiers and Native American allies, led by the formidable Seneca chief known as Half King. These indigenous warriors brought invaluable knowledge of the terrain and French movements, but their presence also complicated the delicate balance of frontier diplomacy. The Half King harbored deep resentment toward the French, who had executed his father years earlier, and his thirst for revenge would soon influence the course of events. The previous day, Washington had received disturbing news from his scouts. A French reconnaissance party, led by Ensign Joseph Cowland de Jumonville, had been spotted moving through the area. The French claimed to be on a diplomatic mission, carrying messages similar to those Washington himself had delivered the previous year. However, the British colonials suspected more sinister intentions. Believing the French were actually spying on British positions and preparing for an attack as dawn broke on that fateful May morning, Washington's combined force of British colonials and Native American warriors surrounded the French camp in a rocky glen. The French soldiers, caught completely off guard while preparing their morning meal, scrambled for their weapons. Jumonville, attempting to read from what appeared to be official diplomatic papers, was struck down in the initial volley. The skirmish lasted only 15 minutes, but its consequences would reverberate across 2 continents. The aftermath of the encounter proved as significant as the battle itself. 10 French soldiers lay dead, including Jumonville, while 21 others were taken prisoner. Only 1 Frenchman escaped to carry news of the attack back to Fort Duquesne. Washington's forces suffered only 1 casualty, but the political ramifications were enormous. The French would claim that Jumonville had been murdered while attempting to deliver diplomatic correspondence, making Washington appear as an assassin rather than a military commander. Historical records from the Virginia Historical Society indicate that this encounter marked the first combat action of what would become a global conflict between European powers. The Half-King's actions during and after the battle added another layer of complexity to the situation. According to several eyewitness accounts, the Seneca chief personally dispatched the wounded Jumonville with a tomahawk blow to the head, an act that horrified the young Washington. The Native American leader then ordered his warriors to scalp the dead French soldiers, despite Washington's protests. These actions, while consistent with indigenous warfare customs, violated European military conventions and provided French propagandists with powerful ammunition for their cause. Washington's own account of the incident, recorded in his journal and later letters, reveals a young officer grappling with the moral complexities of frontier warfare. He wrote of feeling the whistling of bullets and experiencing something charming in the sound, displaying the mixture of excitement and naivety that characterized many of his early military experiences. Yet he also expressed discomfort with the brutal realities of combat, particularly the treatment of prisoners and the dead. The prisoners taken during the Jumonville incident provided valuable intelligence about French military preparations. Under interrogation, they revealed that Fort Duquesne was being reinforced with additional troops and artillery, which, more ominously, they spoke of a large French and Native American force being assembled to drive British colonials from the Ohio Valley. This information prompted Washington to accelerate his defensive preparations at Great Meadows, where he would soon face his greatest test as a military commander. News of the Jumonville incident spread rapidly through the colonial settlements and across the Atlantic to European capitals. In London, government officials initially celebrated Washington's aggressive action as a necessary defense of British interests. However, in Paris, the French court denounced the attack as an unprovoked assault on diplomatic personnel. The incident provided both sides with justification for the broader conflict that was already brewing between Britain and France over their respective North American empires. The sound of axes echoing through the Great Meadows marked the beginning of what would become George Washington's most humbling military experience. It was early June 1754, and the young lieutenant colonel had chosen this natural clearing in the Pennsylvania wilderness as the site for a hastily constructed fortification. The circular palisade, which Washington optimistically named Fort Necessity, would soon become the scene of his first significant defeat and a harsh lesson in the realities of frontier warfare. The fort's location, while strategically positioned to control the main route between Virginia and the Ohio Valley, suffered from critical defensive weaknesses that would prove disastrous. The stockade sat in a natural depression surrounded by wooded hills, providing enemy marksmen with commanding positions from which to rain down fire upon the defenders. Additionally, the fort's small size could barely accommodate Washington's growing force of approximately 400 men. creating cramped conditions that would worsen as the siege progressed. As construction continued, Washington received intelligence that a large French and Native American force was advancing from Fort Duquesne under the command of Captain Louis Cowlin de Villiers, the half-brother of the slain ensign Jumonville. The French officer had been specifically chosen to lead this expedition because of his personal stake in avenging his brother's death. This force, numbering nearly 700 men, included not only French regulars and Canadian militia, but also warriors from various Native American tribes who had allied themselves with France. The weather, which had been cooperative during the fort's construction, turned against the defenders as July approached. Heavy rains transformed the ground around Fort Necessity into a muddy quagmire, making movement difficult and keeping the defenders' gunpowder damp. The constant moisture also affected the men's morale as they huddled in their makeshift shelters, while water seeped through the wooden walls of their inadequate fortress. On July 3, 1754, the French and their Native American allies launched their assault on Fort Necessity. The attack began at approximately 11 o'clock in the morning, with enemy forces taking positions on the surrounding hills and in the nearby woods. From these elevated positions, French marksmen could fire down into the fort with devastating effectiveness. The defenders' return fire was largely ineffective due to the enemy's superior cover and positioning. Contemporary accounts, preserved in the Pennsylvania colonial records, describe the siege as a masterful display of wilderness warfare tactics employed by French and Native American forces. The battle raged throughout the day, with neither side able to achieve a decisive advantage. Washington's men, despite their disadvantageous position, fought with remarkable determination. The Virginia militia, though inexperienced in formal warfare, demonstrated the frontier skills that would later prove invaluable in the American Revolution. They used every available piece of cover, fired from behind overturned supply wagons, and maintained their defensive positions despite heavy casualties. As the afternoon wore on, the situation inside Fort Necessity became increasingly desperate. Casualties mounted steadily, with nearly one-third of Washington's force either killed or wounded. The fort's medical facilities, never adequate for such a large garrison, became overwhelmed with injured men. Ammunition supplies dwindled rapidly, and the wet conditions made it difficult to keep the remaining gunpowder dry and effective. The psychological pressure on the young Washington was immense. This was his first major independent command, and the lives of hundreds of men depended on his decisions. He moved constantly throughout the fort, encouraging his troops, directing defensive efforts, and attempting to maintain morale despite the increasingly hopeless situation. His personal courage under fire earned him the respect of his men, even as military circumstances deteriorated around them. As evening approached, the French intensified their assault, and it became clear that Fort Necessity could not withstand another day of siege. The defenders were exhausted, their ammunition was nearly depleted, and their position was militarily untenable. When Captain Cowlin de Villiers sent a messenger forward under a flag of truce, Washington faced the difficult decision of whether to continue a hopeless fight or negotiate surrender terms. The surrender negotiations took place in the rain-soaked darkness of July 3rd. With Washington and his officers meeting with French representatives in a tent outside the fort, the terms offered by the French were surprisingly generous, allowing the British colonial forces to withdraw with their weapons and personal belongings. However, the surrender document contained language that would later prove politically damaging to Washington, as it referred to the assassination of Jumonville rather than his death in battle. The ink had barely dried on the surrender document when Washington began to comprehend the full implications of his defeat at Fort Necessity. The morning of July 4th, 1754, found him leading his bedraggled column of survivors eastward through the Pennsylvania wilderness, their spirits as dampened as their rain-soaked uniforms. The retreat from Great Meadows marked not only a military setback, but also a crucial learning experience that would shape Washington's future approach to warfare and leadership. The terms of surrender, negotiated in the darkness and confusion of the previous night, had seemed reasonable. Under the circumstances, Captain Cowan de Villiers had allowed the British colonial forces to withdraw with their weapons and colors, taking their wounded with them. The French commander had even provided wagons to transport the injured, a gesture of military courtesy that Washington would long remember. However, the surrender document contained a crucial phrase that would haunt Washington for years to come. The document, written in French and hastily translated by the inexperienced Jacob Van Braam, referred to Juneville's death as an assassination rather than a legitimate act of war. Washington, exhausted and focused on saving his men's lives, had signed the document without fully understanding its implications. This linguistic trap would later be exploited by French propagandists who portrayed the young Virginia officer as a treacherous murderer rather than a military commander acting in defense of British interests. The retreat itself proved nearly as challenging as the siege had been. The wounded men, transported in crude wagons over rough forest trails, suffered terribly from their injuries and the constant jostling of the journey. Washington ordered frequent stops to tend to the injured, despite the risk that French or Native American forces might pursue and attack his vulnerable column. This concern for his men's welfare, even in defeat, demonstrated the compassionate leadership that would characterize his entire military career. Documentation from the Virginia Gazette provides contemporary accounts of the colonial reaction to Washington's defeat and the lessons learned from the Fort Necessity campaign. The psychological impact of defeat weighed heavily on Washington's mind during the long march back to Virginia. He had volunteered for frontier service with dreams of military glory and advancement within the British military hierarchy. Instead, he found himself leading a defeated army, having lost his first major engagement, and signed a document that admitted to assassination. The experience forced him to confront the harsh realities of military leadership and the heavy responsibility that came with commanding men in combat. Upon reaching Virginia, Washington faced a mixed reception from colonial authorities and the public. Governor Dinwiddie, while disappointed by the military outcome, recognized that the young officer had performed admirably under extremely difficult circumstances. The Virginia House of Burgesses voted to thank Washington and his men for their service, acknowledging that they had faced overwhelming odds against a superior force. However, critics questioned his tactical decisions and the wisdom of constructing Fort Necessity in such a vulnerable location. The defeat at Fort Necessity also had significant strategic consequences for British colonial policy in North America. The loss demonstrated that the French and their Native American allies were far more formidable opponents than British officials had anticipated. The French success encouraged other indigenous tribes to ally with France, while colonial militia units became more reluctant to venture into the contested Ohio Valley. The balance of power in the region had shifted decisively in France's favor. Washington's own analysis of the defeat revealed a growing military sophistication that would serve him well in future conflicts. He recognized that his force had been too small for the mission assigned, that the fort's location had been poorly chosen, and that adequate supplies and reinforcements had been lacking. He also understood that frontier warfare required different tactics than conventional European military doctrine suggested, particularly regarding the use of Native American allies and the importance of maintaining secure supply lines. The experience of defeat also taught Washington valuable lessons about the importance of intelligence gathering and diplomatic relations with indigenous peoples. The French success had been largely due to their superior knowledge of the terrain and their ability to maintain alliances with local tribes. Washington began to understand that winning in the North American wilderness required more than just military prowess. It demanded cultural sensitivity, diplomatic skill, and a deep understanding of the complex relationships between European powers and Native American nations. Despite the immediate disappointment of defeat, Washington's performance at Fort Necessity enhanced his reputation among Virginia's political elite. His courage under fire, concern for his men's welfare, and dignified conduct during the surrender negotiations impressed observers, who would later support his rise to higher military and political positions. The defeat had been a harsh teacher, but it had also revealed the character traits that would eventually make him one of history's most respected military leaders. The crisp autumn air of 1754 carried both the scent of changing leaves and the promise of renewed conflict as George Washington contemplated his future in military service. The humiliation of fort necessity still stung, but the young officer had learned valuable lessons from defeat that would prove invaluable in the challenges ahead. When British officials announced plans for a massive expedition to reclaim the Ohio Valley, Washington found himself drawn back to the frontier despite his earlier disappointments. The new campaign would be led by Major General Edward Braddock, a veteran British officer with extensive experience in European warfare but little knowledge of North American conditions. Braddock's expedition represented the largest military force ever assembled in colonial North America, consisting of over 2,000 regular British troops, supplemented by colonial militia units and Native American scouts. The general's reputation for strict discipline and tactical expertise had preceded him across the Atlantic, inspiring confidence among colonial officials who believed that professional European military leadership would succeed where colonial forces had failed. Washington's appointment as a volunteer aide-de-camp to General Braddock came through the influence of powerful Virginia political figures who recognized his intimate knowledge of the Ohio Valley terrain. The position offered no formal rank or pay, but it provided the young officer with an opportunity to observe professional military operations firsthand and to rehabilitate his reputation following the Fort Necessity defeat. More importantly, it placed him at the center of what promised to be the most significant military campaign in North American history. The relationship between Washington and Braddock began cordially but soon revealed fundamental differences in their approaches to warfare. The British general, accustomed to the ordered battlefields of Europe, insisted on maintaining traditional military formations and procedures regardless of terrain or enemy tactics. Washington, seasoned by his frontier experiences, advocated for more flexible approaches that took advantage of colonial fighting methods and Native American alliance systems. These philosophical differences would prove crucial in the coming campaign. During the winter months of 1754 and 1755, Washington served as a liaison between Braddock's headquarters and Virginia's colonial government. This role required him to coordinate supply arrangements, recruit additional colonial troops, and provide intelligence about French positions and capabilities. The experience exposed him to the complexities of managing a large military operation, including the challenges of maintaining adequate supplies, coordinating between different military units, and managing relationships with civilian authorities. Military historians from the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation have noted that Washington's service with Braddock provided crucial training in staff work and large-scale military planning that would prove invaluable during the Revolutionary War. The recruitment of colonial troops for Braddock's expedition proved more challenging than British officials had anticipated. Many potential volunteers were reluctant to serve under British officers who showed little respect for colonial military traditions or experience. Washington's presence on Braddock's staff helped bridge this cultural gap, as colonial recruits trusted his judgment and appreciated his understanding of their concerns. His efforts resulted in the recruitment of several hundred Virginia militiamen who would supplement Braddock's regular forces. One of Washington's most significant contributions to the expedition was his work with Native American allies. Unlike many British officers who viewed indigenous peoples as unreliable auxiliaries, Washington recognized their crucial importance in frontier warfare. He spent considerable time building relationships with tribal leaders, learning their customs, and incorporating their intelligence about French activities into Braddock's planning process. These diplomatic efforts yielded valuable information about French troop movements and defensive preparations at Fort Duquesne. The logistical challenges of moving Braddock's massive force through the Pennsylvania wilderness tested Washington's organizational abilities and patience. The expedition required hundreds of wagons, thousands of pack animals, and an enormous quantity of supplies ranging from ammunition to medical equipment. Washington coordinated with colonial contractors to provide these necessities, often working 18-hour days to ensure that the expedition remained on schedule. The experience taught him valuable lessons about military logistics that would prove crucial in his later career. As spring arrived in 1755, the expedition began its advance toward Fort Duquesne. Washington's role expanded beyond staff work to include active reconnaissance and intelligence gathering. He led scouting parties deep into enemy territory, gathering information about French defensive positions and troop strength. These dangerous missions required all the frontier skills he had developed during his earlier service, including the ability to move silently through dense forests and to interpret signs of enemy activity. The march through the Pennsylvania wilderness proved grueling for Braddock's European-trained soldiers who struggled with the rough terrain and unfamiliar climate. Washington observed their difficulties with growing concern. Recognizing that their rigid training and equipment were poorly suited to American conditions, he repeatedly urged Braddock to adopt more flexible tactics and to make greater use of colonial troops who were accustomed to frontier warfare, but the general remained committed to conventional European military methods. The morning of July 9, 1755, dawned clear and humid as General Braddock's expedition approached the final miles to Fort Duquesne. Washington, despite suffering from a severe fever that had nearly forced him to abandon the campaign, rode alongside the British commander as their massive force wound through the dense Pennsylvania forest. The young aide-de-camp's illness had kept him bedridden for days, but he had insisted on joining the final advance despite his weakened condition and the protests of the expedition's physicians. The British force presented an impressive sight as it marched through the wilderness. In perfect formation, red-coated regulars maintained their ranks despite the challenging terrain, while colonial militia units and Native American scouts ranged ahead to provide intelligence about French positions. The sound of over 2,000 men moving through the forest, accompanied by hundreds of pack animals and supply wagons, created a constant din that could be heard for miles around. This lack of tactical stealth concerned Washington, who had learned from his frontier experiences that surprise was often crucial in wilderness warfare. Braddock's confidence in his force's capabilities has grown throughout the long march from Virginia. His professional soldiers had performed admirably during the difficult journey, maintaining discipline and morale despite the hardships of frontier travel. The general had dismissed warnings from Washington and other colonial officers about the unconventional tactics employed by French and Native American forces, insisting that disciplined European troops would easily defeat any enemy they encountered. This overconfidence would prove fatal in the hours ahead. The French commanders at Fort Duquesne, led by Captain Daniel Leonard de Beaujeu, had been monitoring Braddock's approach through an extensive network of Native American scouts. Unlike the British, who relied primarily on European military intelligence methods, the French had developed sophisticated early warning systems that utilized indigenous knowledge of the terrain and traditional hunting skills. This intelligence advantage allowed them to prepare a devastating ambush that would exploit every weakness in Braddock's conventional approach to warfare. At approximately 1 o'clock in the afternoon, the British advance guard encountered the French ambush force near the Monongahela River, just 8 miles from Fort Duquesne. The initial contact seemed favorable to the British, as their disciplined volleys drove back the French attackers. However, this early success proved deceptive, as the main French and Native American force had positioned themselves in the dense woods surrounding the narrow forest road. Within minutes, the British found themselves surrounded by an enemy they could barely see, taking devastating casualties from all directions. Contemporary accounts from the Pennsylvania Journal described the battle as a catastrophic demonstration of the differences between European and American warfare methods. The British response to the ambush revealed the limitations of conventional military training in wilderness conditions. Braddock's soldiers, trained to fight in the open battlefields of Europe, attempted to maintain their formations and fire disciplined volleys at a largely invisible enemy. The French and their Native American allies, firing from behind trees and natural cover, picked off British officers and soldiers with deadly accuracy. The red uniforms that marked British military pride made excellent targets in the green wilderness setting. Washington's performance during the battle demonstrated both his personal courage and his growing understanding of American warfare. Despite his illness and the chaos surrounding him, he repeatedly rode between British units, attempting to coordinate their response and encourage their resistance. His familiarity with frontier fighting methods enabled him to provide valuable tactical advice to officers who found themselves completely out of their element in the wilderness ambush. Multiple horses were shot from beneath him, and his coat was pierced by several musket balls, but he continued to function effectively throughout the engagement. The death of General Braddock, mortally wounded while attempting to rally his troops, marked the beginning of the British forces' complete collapse. Without their commander's leadership, professional soldiers who had marched so confidently through the wilderness began to panic and flee. The careful formations that had been the pride of European military tradition disintegrated into chaos as men abandoned their weapons and equipment in desperate attempts to escape the withering fire from the surrounding woods. Washington found himself thrust into a position of crucial importance as one of the few remaining officers capable of organizing an effective retreat. Working with the surviving British and colonial officers, he managed to establish a defensive perimeter that allowed hundreds of soldiers to escape what might otherwise have been a complete massacre. His ability to remain calm under extreme pressure and to inspire confidence in panicking troops demonstrated the leadership qualities that would later make him invaluable during the American Revolution. The retreat from the Monongahela became almost as devastating as the battle itself. The surviving British forces, many of them wounded and demoralized, struggled to maintain cohesion as they fled through the same wilderness they had marched through so confidently just hours earlier. Washington and other officers worked tirelessly to prevent the retreat from becoming a complete rout. Organizing rearguard actions and ensuring that the wounded were not abandoned to their fate, the aftermath of Braddock's defeat sent shockwaves throughout the British colonies and across the Atlantic to London. The destruction of the largest British military force ever assembled in North America demonstrated that European military superiority could not be taken for granted in the American wilderness. For Washington, the disaster provided profound lessons about the nature of American warfare and the importance of adapting military tactics to local conditions. Lessons that would prove invaluable in his future military career. The smoke from the Monongahela battlefield had barely cleared when George Washington found himself facing the most challenging period of his young military career. The catastrophic defeat of General Braddock's expedition had left the Virginia frontier virtually defenseless against French and Native American raids. While colonial authorities struggled to comprehend the magnitude of their military disaster, at 23, Washington was appointed commander of the Virginia Regiment, tasked with defending over 300 miles of frontier with fewer than 1,000 poorly equipped men. The appointment came with enormous responsibility but little authority. The Virginia House of Burgesses, while recognizing Washington's courage and competence during the Braddock campaign, provided minimal funding and resources for frontier defense. Colonial officials in Williamsburg seemed to believe that a few hundred militia could accomplish what Braddock's professional army had failed to achieve. Washington quickly discovered that political leadership during wartime required skills far different from those needed on the battlefield. The French and Indian raids that followed Braddock's defeat tested Washington's strategic thinking and organizational abilities to their limits. Unlike the conventional warfare he had observed during his service with British regulars, frontier defense required a completely different approach. Enemy forces struck quickly and unpredictably, attacking isolated settlements, killing or capturing civilians, and disappearing back into the wilderness before colonial forces could respond. Washington had to develop new tactics that emphasized mobility, intelligence gathering, and cooperation with friendly Native American tribes. The construction of a chain of defensive forts along the Virginia frontier became Washington's primary strategic response to the raiding threat. These fortifications, including Fort Loudon, Fort Edwards, and Fort Dinwiddie, provided secure bases for patrol operations and safe havens for frontier families during attacks. However, building and maintaining these forts required enormous resources and skilled labor that were often unavailable. Washington spent countless hours coordinating with colonial contractors, negotiating with local officials, and personally supervising construction work to ensure that his defensive system would be effective. Recruitment and training of colonial soldiers presented another major challenge for the young commander. Many potential volunteers were reluctant to serve in a military organization that offered poor pay, inadequate equipment, and the constant threat of violent death. Washington had to rely on his personal reputation and powers of persuasion to attract men to his regiment, often accepting volunteers who lacked basic military skills or proper equipment. The task of transforming these diverse recruits into an effective fighting force required patience, determination, and innovative training methods. Military records preserved in the Virginia Historical Society document Washington's systematic approach to creating an effective colonial military force. Despite limited resources and political constraints, the relationship between Washington's Virginia Regiment and the various Native American tribes in the region proved crucial to frontier defense efforts. Unlike many colonial officers who viewed all indigenous peoples as potential enemies, Washington understood that tribal alliances could be decisive in frontier warfare. He spent considerable time learning about different tribal customs, negotiating agreements with friendly chiefs, and coordinating joint operations against common enemies. These diplomatic efforts often proved more valuable than conventional military actions. The psychological toll of frontier warfare affected Washington deeply during these years. The constant threat of attack, the responsibility for civilian lives, and the frustration of operating with inadequate resources created enormous stress. He witnessed the aftermath of numerous raids, saw families destroyed by violence, and struggled with the knowledge that his limited forces could not protect everyone. Letters from this period reveal a young officer grappling with the moral complexities of warfare and the heavy burden of command. Responsibility. Washington's administrative skills developed rapidly during his service as Virginia Regiment commander. He learned to manage complex supply systems, coordinate with civilian authorities, and maintain detailed records of military operations. These seemingly mundane skills would prove invaluable during the Revolutionary War, when logistical capabilities often determined the outcome of military campaigns. His experience in dealing with uncooperative colonial governments also prepared him for the political challenges he would face as Continental Army commander. The Forbes expedition of 1758 provided Washington with his final major experience in the French and Indian War, serving under General John Forbes. He participated in the successful campaign that finally captured Fort Duquesne, renaming it Fort Pitt in honor of British Prime Minister William Pitt. The expedition's success validated many of the tactical lessons Washington had learned during his frontier service, particularly the importance of adapting European military methods to American conditions. The fall of Fort Duquesne marked the effective end of French power in the Ohio Valley and the beginning of British dominance in the region. For Washington, it represented the successful conclusion of a military education that had begun with his diplomatic mission to the French in 1753. The young officer who had volunteered for frontier service with dreams of military glory had been transformed into a seasoned commander with deep understanding of American warfare, colonial politics, and military leadership. As the French and Indian War wound down, Washington resigned his commission and returned to civilian life at Mount Vernon. However, the experiences of his frontier service had forged the character and skills that would make him indispensable during the American Revolution. The lessons learned in the Virginia wilderness about leadership, logistics, diplomacy, and the nature of American warfare would prove crucial when the colonies faced their ultimate test for independence. The young officer who had tasted both victory and defeat in the forests of Pennsylvania had been prepared by experience for the greater challenges that lay ahead in the struggle for American liberty.